The United States Navy described its observation pilots as the fleet's vision. That was the official language used by the Bureau of Aeronautics when the OS2U Kingfisher entered active service in 1940, and when the aircraft became standard equipment aboard every battleship and cruiser catapult squadron throughout the war. Naval aviation doctrine defined the role of the observation pilot as essential for naval gunfire, correction, reconnaissance patrols, submarine searches, and the recovery of downed airmen from stretches of ocean where no conventional aircraft could safely land. In official publications, the Kingfisher appeared as a highly adaptable machine carrying out multiple vital assignments for the fleet. The men inside those cockpits were told they occupied a critical position in naval warfare. What those manuals never explained was the brutal reality hidden behind the phrase, "eyes of the fleet." Now, they did not describe what it felt like inside the cockpit of a Kingfisher during the instant of launch, when the aircraft was hurled from the catapult of a battleship or cruiser with zero forward airspeed, accelerated to nearly 140 feet per second across only 40 feet of track, generating roughly 27 G of force through the pilot's body in less than half a second. Nor did those documents explain what happened hours afterward when the aircraft had remained over empty Pacific water for 6 exhausting hours, while the warship that launched it had shifted position beyond visual range, weather conditions had deteriorated, and fuel calculations had become a race against time. Eventually, the pilot had to land on open ocean water regardless of wave height, swell pattern, or sea conditions at the moment of descent. The Navy called them the fleet's eyes. The operational reports used very different language. Between December of 1941 and August of 1945, the United States Navy lost 179 OS2U Kingfishers through combat, operational mishaps, severe weather, failed ocean landings, and the category listed in accident investigations as catapult malfunction. That term referred to the moments when the launch mechanism responsible for accelerating a fully loaded aircraft from a standstill to flying velocity within 40 feet failed to operate inside the tolerances required for pilot survival. Out of roughly 1,500 Kingfishers that served in wartime naval aviation, nearly 1 aircraft in every 8 was destroyed. The men assigned to fly them operated one of the slowest aircraft in the Pacific theater. The Kingfisher's top speed reached only 164 miles per hour, slower than every Japanese combat aircraft likely to intercept it, slower even than many American aircraft whose crews those pilots might later attempt to rescue. Against a Japanese zero over contested waters, the Kingfisher lacked the speed necessary for meaningful evasive maneuvering. Most missions were flown without escort aircraft. Radar was generally absent. The pilots crossed oceans transformed by the Pacific War into enormous contested battle zones that pre-war naval doctrine had never fully anticipated. Official training material categorized the aircraft as an observation platform. The Imperial Japanese Navy categorized it as an easy kill. That difference between institutional language and battlefield reality existed inside the hard physics of the aircraft itself and the impossible tasks attached to it. The Vought OS2U Kingfisher, the principal wartime production model, was a single-engine low-wing monoplane built for catapult launches from warships. It could operate either with floats or standard landing gear. Its Pratt & Whitney R985A2 Wasp Junior radial engine generated 450 horsepower. Maximum speed at sea level reached 164 miles per hour. Cruising speed settled around 119 miles per hour, close to the operating range of the PBY Catalina. That performance placed the aircraft firmly into a category where almost anything hostile in the sky could overtake it with ease. With standard fuel capacity, operational range extended to 805 miles. Defensive armament consisted of only 2 .30 caliber machine guns, one synchronized forward-firing weapon through the propeller arc, and a second flexible gun mounted in the rear cockpit for the observer. It represented the bare minimum defensive firepower carried by any armed aircraft during the Second World War. Against Japanese fighters, the comparison was humiliatingly uneven. Physically, the aircraft remained relatively light. Empty weight stood at 4,123 pounds, while full catapult launch configuration brought total loaded weight to 6,000 pounds. The structure itself was sturdy enough to survive open ocean landings in sea conditions that would have shattered racing float planes, but durability had limits. Early production versions lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. Armor protection was almost non-existent. Nothing in the aircraft's design significantly reduced the damage caused when enemy rounds penetrated the fuselage. More than any other factor, the catapult launch defined the Kingfisher experience. No other branch of naval aviation subjected pilots to quite the same physical violence, though training manuals reduced the process into sterile procedural language that explained sequence without explaining sensation. The powder catapults installed aboard Iowa-class battleships and Baltimore-class cruisers operated along twin rail tracks mounted on deck or superstructure sections. The launch rails were usually angled abeam or slightly aft in order to avoid interference from the ship's own structures and to provide the best available wind conditions for initial climb after release. The Kingfisher, carrying floats, full fuel tanks, and ordnance load, rested on the catapult carriage, while the pilot's body sat twisted at an angle relative to the direction of acceleration. That angle had already been calculated by the catapult officer according to wind speed, ship velocity, and sea conditions at the exact moment of launch. The pilot advanced the engine to maximum power. The catapult officer completed final verification. Then the firing system discharged in an instant. In barely 4 seconds, the aircraft accelerated from a dead stop to nearly 55 knots. During that violent interval, the pilot's body absorbed approximately 27 GIB of forward horizontal force, the equivalent of 27 times his own weight compressed into less than half a second. Training taught pilots to force their backs and heads against the seat, loosen the muscles that instinctively resisted the acceleration, and keep their hands steady on the controls without introducing movements that could destabilize the aircraft as it left the catapult rail barely above stall speed. The floats skimmed only inches over the water while the engine strained at maximum power, trying to build enough speed to transform catastrophe into controlled flight. That was merely the beginning. The actual mission came afterward. Observation pilots flew ahead of the fleet or circled beyond it, searching for enemy warships and submarines, correcting naval gunfire, patrolling designated sectors, and increasingly as the war intensified, performing the task that became the Kingfisher's most important contribution of all: rescue. The aircraft descended into open ocean waters where no ship could safely enter, and where no conventional aircraft could land. Naval doctrine had originally assigned gunfire correction as the Kingfisher's primary responsibility, yet that assignment also placed the airplane in the most dangerously exposed position imaginable. An observation aircraft correcting bombardment fire must operate directly over or beside the target area under attack. By definition, the target's anti-aircraft defenses were fully active at the same moment the aircraft appeared overhead. To perform its role effectively, the pilot had to maintain a predictable flight pattern above the objective long enough to observe shell impacts and radio correction data back to the warship conducting the bombardment. The Kingfisher carried out those missions at a cruising speed of only 119 miles per hour, without fighter protection, without armor plating, armed with little more than .30 caliber machine guns, while Japanese shore installations fired upward with every anti-aircraft weapon available. Official doctrine labeled this exposure acceptable operational risk. The men inside those cockpits used much harsher language. The statistics behind Kingfisher operations reveal a different kind of wartime story than the casualty numbers attached to destroyers or aircraft carriers. Losses did not occur primarily in massive headline battles. Instead, they accumulated quietly across hundreds of separate missions in every theater of the war. Each mission became an individual contest between a two-man crew flying a slow float plane in whatever conditions the Pacific decided to produce that day. From 1942 through 1945, Kingfisher squadrons operated from every American battleship and cruiser assigned to the Pacific. They also served aboard Atlantic and Mediterranean warships, from shore stations in Alaska, from Caribbean bases, and from the Forward Islands captured during the Central Pacific Campaign. Mission details survived inside the action reports of the vessels that carried them: the archives of USS South Dakota, the records of USS Indianapolis, the operational logs of every ship equipped with a catapult and observation squadron. When those reports are assembled together, they reveal an operational reality that training manuals never fully conveyed. Among all missions flown by the Kingfisher, the open ocean rescue role deserves special attention because operational records show it became the aircraft's greatest humanitarian contribution to the war. At the same time, it imposed the combination of conditions most likely to destroy both airplane and crew. A carrier pilot forced into the sea after a strike mission, a B-29 crewman surviving a crash landing in the Pacific, a patrol aircraft crew drifting inside life rafts 200 miles from land. These men needed extraction, and under those circumstances, the Kingfisher was frequently the only aircraft capable of reaching them. Not because the airplane had been specifically designed for rescue operations. It had not. Its intended purpose remained observation and artillery spotting. But it possessed one critical advantage. It could land on water where no other American aircraft with comparable operational range could safely touch down. The men floating in the Pacific needed something that could land beside them and bring them aboard. The Kingfisher happened to be available. Yet the physics involved in landing a float plane on open Pacific water differed dramatically from the calm procedures described in training manuals. A protected harbor or sheltered anchorage represented a manageable environment that pilots specifically practiced during instruction. Open ocean operations in swells reaching 2 to 3 meters create an entirely different challenge. Pilots approached on headings chosen to reduce the impact of the swell cycle during landing, while also maneuvering toward survivors who themselves might be drifting with wind and current. The Kingfisher's central float extended roughly 10 feet beneath the fuselage and served as the primary contact surface during landing and takeoff. In calm water, its hydrodynamic behavior remained reasonably predictable during the flare, the moment when the pilot reduced power, lifted the nose, and settled toward the surface. In heavy swell, predictability disappeared. Ocean swells rise and fall several feet each second. Whether the float touched rising water or descending water at the instant of contact determined everything afterward. A gradual impact allowed manageable deceleration. A poorly timed contact produced sudden violent forces capable of structurally damaging the aircraft. The result might leave the airplane floating but incapable of taking off again, turning the rescue aircraft into another stranded object in need of rescue itself. Pilots, who repeated these operations many times later, described the approach as a calculation, impossible to master through training alone. They studied the rhythm of the swell, timed the flare, selected a contact point, and then accepted whatever shape the ocean surface possessed when the float finally touched water. Experience improved their judgment in ways difficult to explain because the improvement was not mechanical procedure. It was instinct refined through repetition, the gradual ability to recognize a wrong landing approach before commitment rather than after impact. When that judgment failed, the most common outcome involved damage to the float itself. The structure crumpled, cracked, or tore open. The aircraft remained buoyant, yet lost the ability to take off. Wartime action reports contain numerous cases where Kingfisher crews joined the very survivors they had arrived to save, crowding together onto rafts or damaged floats while waiting for a destroyer dispatched later after it became obvious the airplane would never leave the water again. One rescue operation illustrates the full cost of these missions more clearly than almost any other. The event involved Lieutenant Junior Grade John Burns and his observer, Aviation Radioman Second Class Alfred Bryce, operating from the cruiser USS Minneapolis in the Coral Sea on the 8th of May, 1942. It became one of the earliest major Kingfisher rescue missions documented during the war and established the pattern for what these operations truly demanded. That day, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, American carrier aircraft launched strikes against Japanese naval forces, while Japanese aircraft simultaneously attacked American carriers. USS Lexington suffered severe hits and eventually sank. Pilots forced to ditch after the engagement drifted in the Coral Sea while the battle environment remained active around them. Japanese aircraft still operated nearby. Japanese surface vessels remained within the area. American warships maneuvered in combat formation and could not halt operations long enough to retrieve isolated survivors individually. Burns launched from Minneapolis, navigated toward the reported positions, and landed in open ocean conditions later described in the action report as moderate swell with 15-knot surface winds. He pulled 2 survivors from the water, placing them onto the Kingfisher's floats and inside the rear cockpit during a rescue process the aircraft had never been designed to support. The situation required improvised handling of injured, exhausted men suffering the mental disorientation caused by prolonged exposure in open sea. At that point, the Kingfisher exceeded safe operational limits. The aircraft carried Burns, his observer, and 2 additional survivors, positioned along the floats in a loading arrangement heavier than the airplane's approved weight limit for water takeoff. Burns understood the numbers. He also understood there was no alternative except attempting departure anyway. He pushed the engine to full power and drove the float across the swell through the long acceleration run required for takeoff. Speed increased slowly against excess weight until aerodynamic lift and engine power finally lifted the aircraft clear of the water by a margin. The official report later described in the clipped language of military paperwork as adequate. Burns returned to Minneapolis. The survivors came back alive. For the mission, he received the Navy Cross. The citation described the rescue itself. What it never described was the internal reality of that takeoff run. A float plane carrying twice the intended passenger load. Hope and Pacific swells refusing cooperation. Engine roaring at maximum output, while the float continued dragging through the water far longer than mathematics said it should. Burns completed 23 additional Kingfisher missions from Minneapolis before catapult operations in his theater concluded. Nowhere in surviving historical records did he ever explain what that moment felt like from inside the cockpit on the 8th of May, 1942. He recorded the weather. He documented the condition of the survivors. He described the operation itself, but he never described the terrifying instant when the aircraft still remained trapped against the water after the point where every performance calculation insisted it should already be airborne. Beyond combat and rescue, the Kingfisher's maintenance demands aboard warships imposed another burden on crews that official doctrine rarely acknowledged. Yet the burden shaped daily life between missions in ways impossible to ignore. Aboard every battleship and cruiser, the Kingfisher remained secured on a rotating catapult, usually mounted near the fantail or along a midship deck position, where the aircraft sat completely exposed to whatever climate the operating theater delivered. In the North Atlantic, winter conditions regularly pushed temperatures below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed across the float and froze onto the control surfaces. Before launch operations could even begin, maintenance crews had to hammer and scrape accumulated ice away from the aircraft so it could fly safely. The Pacific created an entirely different punishment. Tropical heat softened the treated fabric stretched over portions of the control surfaces. Rubber seals inside the fuel system deteriorated faster under the temperature extremes, while aluminum components expanded from heat in ways maintenance tolerances constantly had to account for. Inside the aircraft, the crew arrangement was brutally simple. The pilot occupied the forward cockpit. Behind him sat the observer, facing aft from a rotating mount that provided access both to the .30 caliber flexible machine gun and to the radio equipment that connected the aircraft to the warship below. That radio made the observer central to nearly every mission. During bombardment operations, he transmitted fall of shot corrections. During reconnaissance patrols, he relayed position reports. During rescue missions, he communicated survivor locations back to the fleet. He was also the second pair of eyes the mission required. The Kingfisher carried no radar. Over empty ocean or hostile coastline, the observer's continuous scan of the sky behind and above the aircraft became the only warning system against Japanese fighters approaching from the rear quarter. The flexible machine gun represented the aircraft's sole defensive response once an attack began. Post-war accounts from surviving observers described the psychological strain of the role with remarkable consistency. Their descriptions differed in detail, yet matched in emotional tone closely enough to establish that the experience was universal rather than individual. The observer faced backward. He saw only where the aircraft had already been. He watched the section of sky from which Japanese fighters most commonly attacked because enemy pilots naturally preferred the rear approach against a slow airplane incapable of meaningful combat maneuvering. If danger appeared, the observer could warn the pilot. He could man the gun. He could do whatever the ballistic limits of a .30 caliber weapon allowed against a fighter closing at nearly 200 miles per hour, but he could not change the aircraft's path. Most observers later explained that prolonged scanning of the rear hemisphere during contested flights produced a mental condition difficult to describe precisely. They often called it waiting. Not alertness in the formal military sense, not disciplined watchfulness alone, something heavier and more constant than that, a background awareness that never completely shut off. Hour after hour, the observer watched the sky behind the aircraft until the tension accumulated into a weight carried beyond the mission itself, partially eased by food, sleep, and debriefings between flights, yet never entirely disappearing. The exhaustion created by Kingfisher operations possessed a character unlike the fatigue experienced by other aviators. Carrier pilots and bomber crews endured moments of extreme concentrated stress during attack dives, bombing runs, or carrier landings, separated by intervals of lower intensity. Kingfisher crews experienced no such rhythm. Their workload remained moderate yet relentless from launch to recovery. The catapult shot, navigation over featureless ocean, exposure during gunfire correction, open water landings, takeoff attempts from swell conditions, the return flight home. None of those phases produced the violent peaks associated with fighter combat, but neither did they provide genuine recovery periods. Stress remained present the entire time. Medical reports compiled by flight surgeons assigned to observation squadrons recorded the consequences repeatedly across months of cruiser and battleship deployments. Sleep disturbances became common. Many aircrew found themselves unable to stop the scanning habit even after leaving the cockpit. Appetite problems appeared regularly. Anxiety intensified before missions involving deteriorating sea conditions or forecasts approaching the safe limits of open ocean operations. That anxiety did not reflect cowardice. It did not represent incompetence. It was the rational psychological response of experienced men who fully understood a physical danger because they had already survived it before. Pilots who had slammed hard into bad swells and felt the aircraft structure absorb forces near its limit knew exactly how narrow the margin could become. They understood the sensation transmitted through the float during heavy impacts. They recognized that if timing failed by only a fraction, the structural load could exceed what the aircraft could survive. Their fear was accurate because their knowledge was accurate. Even so, they launched again. They flew into marginal weather because missions demanded it. Experience gave them judgment, and judgment allowed them to manage conditions that often bordered on the unsafe. Sometimes skill proved enough, sometimes it did not. When circumstances exceeded what experience could solve, crews ended up in the ocean beside the men they had attempted to rescue. Occasionally they drifted there alone. The fleet responded however it could. Another Kingfisher launched if another aircraft remained available. A destroyer might be dispatched if the tactical situation allowed it. Sometimes the search located the missing crew, sometimes it did not. When that happened, the operational log received the same final notation wartime records always used when an aircraft failed to return. The post-war fate of the Kingfisher revealed the truth about its operational limitations more honestly than most official histories ever did. Almost immediately after the war ended, helicopters replaced it. Rotary wing aircraft could perform rescue work with greater reliability. They could execute observation duties adequately. They did not require catapults. They landed directly on ship decks instead of open ocean water. In nearly every operational category that mattered, helicopters solved the same problems more effectively than the Kingfisher had since 1940. The men who flew the aircraft understood that reality long before anyone formally explained it. They knew they were not flying the Navy's premier weapon. They were not the glamorous edge of naval aviation. They were the crews sent out in slow float planes to spot submarines, correct naval gunfire, and recover pilots from superior aircraft, unlucky enough to end up floating in the Pacific, waiting for whatever rescue platform happened to exist. And what existed was the Kingfisher. One of those men was aviation machinist's mate first class Donald C. WWII of Gloucester, Massachusetts. From September of 1944 until the war ended, he served as observer aboard Kingfisher No. 9 on the battleship USS New Jersey. He was 26 years old. Raised in Gloucester, a hard fishing town, he understood the Atlantic in the practical way New England men raised near the sea often did. Not as scenery, not as abstraction, as something alive with recognizable moods, patterns, and warnings. He volunteered for naval aviation as an observer, partly because flight pay exceeded standard surface fleet pay, and partly because flying carried the particular attraction that military aviation held for young men in 1942. Between September of 1944 and August of 1945, he flew 29 missions from New Jersey across the western Pacific. He corrected gunfire over Japanese positions in the Philippines and Okinawa. He flew reconnaissance patrols over waters the fleet needed searched. On the 12th of April 1945, he participated in a rescue mission after New Jersey's Kingfisher received orders to recover a Marine F-4U Corsair pilot who had ditched roughly 40 miles northeast of Okinawa after anti-aircraft fire struck his aircraft during a ground support operation. As the Kingfisher descended, CV transmitted position and condition reports. The swell interval measured roughly 8 seconds in seas reaching 2 meters, conditions the pilot judged manageable. The landing itself went smoothly enough. The Corsair pilot waited inside a raft and remained in relatively stable condition despite a leg wound caused by anti-aircraft fragments that had also destroyed his airplane. The injury bled, but not beyond what compression and basic treatment could control. To bring the survivor aboard, CV climbed from the rear cockpit onto the float while the aircraft pitched in 2-meter swell. He balanced himself against the motion, helped the injured pilot out of the raft, and guided the approximately 180-pound man across the float and into the rear cockpit, despite the fact the Kingfisher had never been specifically engineered for such operations. The transfer required improvisation, strength, timing. It took 11 minutes. The takeoff run consumed another 4 minutes. Eventually, the float separated from the water, with what CV later described in a letter to his wife, written aboard New Jersey 4 days afterward, as enough margin. He never clarified what enough actually meant. Instead, he wrote about the rescued pilot himself, Norman Klug from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He wrote about what the man kept saying while they pulled him from the raft, words involving his wife that CV admitted he would not repeat inside a letter home, though he confessed those words stayed in his mind afterward. After the war, CV returned to Gloucester and resumed life as a fisherman. For 33 years, he worked the waters off Cape Ann aboard first his own boat, then his son's, and eventually his grandson's vessel. He died in 1988 at 70 years old. Family members later described him as someone unusually calm during rough weather, a man whose relationship with dangerous seas extended beyond ordinary professional experience. In 2004, his grandson wrote an account for a Gloucester Historical Society project, describing a conversation they once shared. He had asked his grandfather the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed at sea. The old man thought quietly for a long time before answering. It was not combat, he finally said, not a storm either. What frightened him most was a 2-meter swell on a perfectly calm day. No wind, only the swell moving beneath the surface, because that kind of water meant an aircraft landing became a very particular negotiation with the ocean itself. And that negotiation could end either way. His grandson admitted he never completely understood the meaning behind the answer, but he remembered it anyway. If this story stayed with you, remember the men inside those slow float planes who flew into conditions most people would never willingly face. Their names rarely became famous. Their aircraft vanished behind the legends of carriers and fighters. Yet out over empty water, they kept searching, landing, rescuing, and launching again because someone had to do it. Share this story, keep their memory alive, and remember the crews the war asked to survive the impossible in silence. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.